The morning I went down on the kitchen floor, I was 7 months along and had not held down so much as a sip of water in 4 days. I still know the exact sound the wooden boards made when my knees met them. I remember the smell of cold ash sitting in the stove I had not yet managed to light, because standing long enough to light it was beyond what my body would allow. I heard Eli's boots on the porch steps outside, that heavy and even rhythm of a man moving toward the barn, away from the house, away from me. The same as every morning of our marriage, the same as it would be tomorrow and the morning after that, as though everything inside these walls was already sorted, already handled, already outside the boundaries of what required his attention. I lay on my side with my cheek flat against the cold wood, and I listened to his footsteps disappear into the distance, and I counted what I could hear. Wind against the east window, the baby in the cradle upstairs beginning to wake, a cow calling from somewhere deep inside the barn. I catalogued every sound in that house, every sound on that farm, every sound moving through the gray morning air around me. The sound of someone coming to help was not anywhere among them. Before I tell you what happened after that morning, let me tell you something about who I am. I was raised Old Order Amish in a small settlement in central Pennsylvania, the third daughter of a farming family where the women rose before the sun and went to sleep after everyone else, and never once referred to any of that as a sacrifice. I married Eli at 20 years old. I was 23 when I lay on that kitchen floor. I am older now, and outside, and I am telling you the thing my community spent years ensuring I would never say aloud. I carry these stories because they were never meant to leave the room where they happened. You need to understand how pregnancy functioned inside my community before I can explain what was done to me and what was not done, and why those two things were ultimately the same wound. Pregnancy in our settlement was not a medical event. It was not a household event. It was a woman's season, and it belonged to her the way the kitchen belonged to her, and the garden belonged to her, and the laundry belonged to her. It was her domain, which is another way of saying it was entirely her problem. There were no appointments with doctors. There was a midwife who came when called, sometimes when she thought to come on her own, and sometimes not at all when the roads were difficult or the season was pressing. No one spoke from the pulpit about what a husband owed his pregnant wife, because the assumption running beneath everything was that he owed her nothing specific, only the general faithfulness of providing a house and food, and the spiritual covering of his headship. What happened inside her body during the 9 months she carried his child was, in the most literal sense of the phrase, not his concern. That phrase was never spoken directly to me. It did not need to be. It was the water I swam in. It was the shape of every conversation I'd ever overheard between married women, the way they spoke about their pregnancies in the past tense, as ordeals survived, as weather endured, never as something their husbands had shared with them or helped them carry. I absorbed this, the way I absorbed everything in my community, not through any formal teaching, but through the 1,000 small silences that instruct more thoroughly than any sermon ever could. I married Eli in the spring of my 20th year. He was 24, the eldest son of a large family from a neighboring district, a man with steady hands and a reputation for fair dealing, and a quietness that everyone who knew him called a virtue. He was not cruel. I want to establish that plainly and early, because the story I am about to tell is not a story about a cruel man. It is a story about something considerably more complicated than cruelty, something that has no clear villain and no clear hero, and yet somehow produces tremendous damage all the same. Eli was a man who had been taught from the very beginning of his life exactly where his responsibilities ended, and they ended at the boundary of my body. The sickness began in my 3rd month. I had been ill with my first pregnancy too, but nothing resembling this. This was a different creature entirely. This was waking at 2 a.m. to retch into a bucket, and then lying on the cold bathroom floor until 4, because the tiles were the only thing that quieted the spinning. This was losing 8 pounds in 6 weeks at a time when I should have been gaining weight. This was a midwife who came, pressed her hands to my abdomen, found the heartbeat, nodded at the baby's position, and moved toward the door without once asking how I myself was managing. I stopped her before she reached it. I asked whether this degree of sickness was within the range of normal. She said some women carry hard. She said it with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a sentence whose real meaning is that you are on your own now. Then she left. That evening, I told Eli I was too sick to make supper. I said it plainly, without drama, the way you report a fact about the weather. I told him I could not stand at the stove that night, that I was too ill. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, something positioned between concern and inconvenience. Then he went to the bread box, cut himself several slices, and ate them standing at the counter. He did not ask whether I had eaten anything. He did not ask what I needed. He did not ask how long I had been feeling this way, or what the midwife had said, or whether there was anything at all he might do. He finished his bread, washed his hands, and went to bed. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after he left. Then I went to the floor because the cool wood offered more comfort than anything else in my body's narrow inventory of options. I lay there in the dark with my hands folded over my stomach, and I thought, with the kind of hollow steadiness I now recognize as a mind protecting itself from something too enormous to absorb all at once, that if I stopped breathing that night, the first person to know would be whoever arrived in the morning to start the fire. 3 days later, Eli's mother came. Her name was Rebecca, and she was a woman I genuinely respected, someone who had raised 7 children, kept an immaculate house, and never once in all the years I had known her said anything that could honestly be called unkind. She arrived with a pot of chicken soup wrapped in towels to hold the warmth. She set it on my stove, sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and studied me with the careful, measuring eyes of a woman taking quiet inventory. I waited for her to ask how I was doing. I waited for her to say something about the shadows beneath my eyes, or the way my dress hung differently now, or the fact that her son had apparently said nothing to her about the condition of his wife. She watched me for a long moment. Then she said with genuine warmth and deep conviction, that the Lord gives a woman what she can carry. I nodded. I waited. There was nothing more. She ladled soup into a bowl, talked about her garden and the neighbor's new barn roof and a letter she had received from a cousin in Indiana, and left an hour later with her empty pot. The door closed behind her. I sat at the table with the soup going cold in front of me, and understood something I did not yet have the language to name. She had not come to help me. She had come to deliver a theological verdict. The verdict was that I was fine, because God had determined I was fine, and therefore the matter was settled. This is the thing about the community of women I grew up inside. They were not absent. They were not cold, not in any way they would have recognized as cold. They came. They brought food. They sat with you. But they brought something alongside the food that I can only describe as a framework, a pre-assembled interpretation of your suffering that arrived before you could even begin to describe the suffering yourself. And that framework meant that your actual experience, the specific and terrible details of what was happening inside your body, never quite had to be heard because it had already been categorized. It was a woman's season. It was her cross. It was the Lord refining her character. A woman who bore it without complaint was a woman of faith. A woman who struggled visibly was a woman who needed to pray more deeply, trust more fully, and ask considerably less. I went to the quilting circle in my 6th month because I could not afford the kind of absence that would be noticed and talked about. I was barely able to sit upright on the bench. I held my needle and tried to keep my hands steady, and I listened to the women around me. At some point, a woman named Sadie began speaking about a young wife 2 settlements over who had, in Sadie's words, made her pregnancy the entire household's burden, who had asked her husband to take on tasks that were not his to take on, who had, and Sadie said this with a gentle shake of her head, forgotten that a man has his own work and his own exhaustion, and cannot be expected to carry what God designed a woman to carry by herself. The room murmured in agreement. No one looked at me, and yet I felt every woman in that room looking at me. I kept my eyes on the needle and thread. I pressed my lips together, and I thought about the floor. I thought about the cold wood beneath my cheek. I thought about Eli's boots walking away, and I thought, they know. They all know. And they have already decided what it means. I began watching Eli during those months, the way you watch something you are trying to understand before it is too late to understand it. Not with anger. Not yet. With something closer to scientific detachment, the kind that holds emotion carefully at a distance, because emotion would make it impossible to see clearly. I watched the way he spoke to his horses with a patience and a gentleness that was entirely genuine, not performed for anyone's benefit. I watched him stop and help a neighbor whose wagon wheel had cracked in the lane outside our house, how he spent 2 hours in the cold without being asked and without any hesitation. I watched him at church suppers, how he listened respectfully when the older men spoke, how he never interrupted, how he carried heavy things for women who were not his wife. He was not a man without tenderness. That was the part hardest to sit with. He was a man whose tenderness had borders, and those borders had been drawn by something much larger and older than either one of us, and he had never once been required to notice where they fell. One night, late in the 7th month, I asked him directly. I waited until the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet, and I sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "Eli, do you understand how sick I have been?" He looked up from the harness strap he was mending. He held my eyes for a long moment with those steady, unreadable ones of his. Then he said, "You're still here, aren't you?" He meant it as comfort. I understood even in that moment that he meant it as evidence of my strength, as a form of affirmation. You survived. Therefore you were strong enough. Therefore everything had unfolded as it should. He returned to his mending. I sat with that sentence inside my chest, like a stone settling through water. And I felt something shift inside me, not dramatically, not with any sound, just a quiet tectonic movement, the way the ground adjusts beneath the surface before anything visible changes above it. I decided that night that I needed to find out whether anyone at all within the boundaries of my known world, could see what I was beginning to see. There was one woman I thought might. Her name was Anna. She was 61 years old and had spent her entire life inside our settlement. She had lost 2 pregnancies, both late, both following months of serious illness, and she had never spoken about either of them publicly. In our community, she was described as a private woman, which was our way of naming someone who had survived something that no one had ever thought to ask about. She lived half a mile from us in a house she had kept on her own since her husband's death 3 years before. She had a quality I can only describe as stillness. Not the stillness of someone with nothing to say, but the stillness of someone who has decided very carefully what they will and will not spend their words on. She came to my house on a Wednesday morning in my 8th month. She brought nothing. No soup, no bread, no casserole wrapped in cloth. She knocked. She came in when I opened the door. She sat down at my kitchen table and she looked at me across the wood with clear, direct eyes. And she said, "Tell me what it has actually been like." I had not been asked that question. Not once. Not by the midwife, not by Rebecca, not by my own mother, who had visited twice and both times spoken primarily about the baby's position and the baby's likely size and the baby's future and the baby's needs. Not by any of the women who had arrived with soup and scripture, not by Eli. Not a single person had asked me what it had actually been like. I opened my mouth to answer, and instead I began to cry. Not gently, not quietly, but the kind of crying that originates somewhere so far down inside you that it frightens you when it finally surfaces. the kind that sounds like something being released that has been held under tremendous pressure for a very long time. Anna did not move toward me. She did not reach across the table. She simply waited, with the patience of someone who has learned that certain kinds of pain need to come out before they can be spoken about, and that the worst possible thing you can do is try to stop them. When I was finally able to speak, I told her everything. The floor, the cold bread, the midwife's expression at the door, Rebecca's theological verdict, Sadie's speech at the quilting circle, the 8 pounds I had lost, the nights I lay awake wondering what would happen to my children if something went wrong inside my body in the dark and no one came until morning. I told her about Eli's sentence. "You're still here, aren't you?" And the way I had felt the ground move beneath me when he said it. Anna listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told me about her own pregnancies. She told me about the first one, the illness that began at 2 months and never stopped. The weight she lost, the way she had lain on the floor of her own kitchen while her husband stood at the counter eating cold bread. She told me about asking for help and receiving the same theological framework I had been handed. She told me about the second pregnancy, how she already knew by then not to ask, how she had moved through 9 months of suffering in a determined silence, and how the baby had come too early anyway, and how she had lain in her bed afterward with empty arms and listened to her husband tell the bishop she was recovering well. She did not cry as she told me any of this. She had, I understood, finished her crying a long time ago. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have made the decision that truth is worth more than the protection of silence. And then she said the thing that rearranged the entire architecture of my understanding. She did not reach for outside words or clinical language, the kind my therapist would offer me years later. She used plain words, Amish words, the only vocabulary available to both of us in that kitchen. She said, "A husband who refuses to see your suffering is not a steady man. He is a man who has been taught that your suffering makes no claim on him, and that is not God's design." She said that was a man's convenience dressed in the clothing of God. She said there is a difference. There has always been a difference. And the only thing that was never true was that we were never given permission to say it aloud. I want to tell you that I went home that afternoon and confronted Eli with everything Anna had said, and that something between us broke open loudly and permanently, the way transformation happens in stories. That is not what happened. What happened is that I went home and made supper and bathed the children and lay down beside Eli in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt the ground that had already shifted once shift again, this time in a direction I could almost name. Something had changed in the way I understood the life I was living. Not loudly, not with any announcement, but the way you realize after a very long time in a dim room that light has been coming through a crack all along, and you simply had not permitted yourself to look directly at it. I began noticing things I had always seen, but never examined. The way every decision in our household passed through Eli without pausing to consider what I thought. The way my exhaustion was acknowledged in principle and ignored in practice. The way the women around me had constructed entire interior lives around the management of being unseen, and had grown so skilled at it that they had come to mistake the skill for contentment. I was still sick. I was still pregnant. But I was no longer alone inside my own understanding of what was happening to me. And that changed everything. The way a single door opening in a sealed house changes the quality of all the air inside it. The baby came in the deep cold of February. Eli was not in the room because that was not our custom. I was surrounded by the midwife and 2 women from the community who had attended many births and were skilled and efficient and kind in the particular way of people who have done a hard thing. So many times they have learned to do it without flinching. They talked me through it steadily. They told me what was happening and what was coming and what I needed to do. They were present with me, in the only way our community knew how to offer presence. The baby was a girl. She came into the world loud and certain, with a full head of dark hair and a fury about her that made the midwife laugh out loud. I held her against my chest, and felt underneath the exhaustion and the relief and the enormous animal love of it, something quieter and more private. A decision forming, not a dramatic one. Not one I could have put into words yet, just a bone-deep knowledge that I was holding a person who had not yet been told what her suffering would and would not be permitted to cost other people. And I thought, I will not be the one to tell her that. I will not carry that particular inheritance forward. Whatever else I give her, I will not give her that. I left our community 2 years after that February morning. That is a different story, and it carries its own enormous weight of loss, of shunning, of the particular grief that belongs to walking away from the only world you have ever known. But the leaving began, I understand now, in Anna's kitchen on a Wednesday morning, when a woman with clear eyes and no soup and no scripture sat across from me and asked the question no one else had thought to ask. It began the moment someone said, "Tell me what it has actually been like." If you have ever been ill and been told that the illness was yours alone to carry, I see you. If you have ever needed someone to move toward you and been handed theology instead of presence, I see you. If you have ever loved a person who was not cruel, but who had simply never been required to understand your suffering as something that concerned him, I see you. You were not too much. You were not failing to carry what you were designed to carry. You were a person inside a system that had decided, long before you arrived, exactly how much of you it was willing to see. And if there is an Anna in your life, a woman who arrives without soup and without scripture, and asks the true question, hold on to her with everything you have. She is rarer than almost anything. She was the reason I finally knew what I was walking toward when I walked. Your suffering was always the household's concern. It was always everyone's business. The only thing that was never true was the silence telling you otherwise. If this story found something inside you, leave your own in the comments. Tell me if you were ever sick and invisible at the same time. Tell me if someone finally asked you the real question. And remember this as you carry it with you. A woman's pain does not diminish because no one chose to look at it. It only grows lonelier. And lonelier was never the same thing as fine.